I'm Cllr Martin Klute. I've been a Labour councillor in Islington for 18 years and I'm chair of the planning committee. My professional background is in technical architecture. Islington is the second most densely populated borough in the country. We have a glorious stock of heritage architecture, we have a thriving cultural offer, and we have, frankly, eye-watering economic and social inequality. We have private houses valued in the millions, cheek by jowl, with council estates with terrible poverty, and 14,000 applications on the council's housing waiting list. Behind me here is the King's Head pub in Upper Street, which has been home to a very famous off-West End pub theatre. I see this as a planning success story that typifies the planning journey in Islington. The pub was privately owned originally by a fellow called Dan Crawford, who was quite a character. The theatre opened in 1970, and thanks to the benevolence and support and also acting as artistic director, the theatre under Dan Crawford thrived for many, many years. It launched the careers of Joanna Lumley, Hugh Grant, Maureen Lipman and other actors of that kind of stature, and has hosted writing by writers such as Stephen Burkoff, Tom Stoppard and Tennessee Williams, all launching new work off West End as a tryout. So it's got a veritable history of nurturing high quality artistic work. After Dan died, Young's acquired the pub, and it quickly became apparent that they were not particularly hospitable to the theatre staying there. And so negotiations began to transfer the theatre to the Islington Square development, which is behind there, which was under construction at the time, to move it into an underground space in that development. 10 years after that, the new theatre has finally opened, with the entrance being directly behind the pub where the theatre used to be. The question is, why did it take so long? And is this another example of local planning authorities being obstructive? Going back to the point I made earlier about the enormous economic and social inequality, if you look at Islington, 70% of the population lives in some form of rented accommodation, either incredibly expensive and poor quality private rented or council social housing rented. And we have a child poverty rate of 37%. Looking back to 2010, the incoming Labour administration at the time established what was called the Fairness Commission, with the intention of trying to find solutions to the inequality of wealth, health, housing, education and crime that were evident in the borough. One of the things that came out of this was the idea that a progressive local plan could act as a lever to address inequality, an approach that's more recently been framed across the council as what's called community wealth building, with the local plan being a key enabler of this approach. And the last priority is to facilitate planning permissions for development that provides a positive contribution to the borough and not to frustrate them. The key drivers for planning policy in Islington are obviously first and foremost housing, trying to provide more of it given the size of the waiting list. We want to try and maintain a stable population, and so we tend to be less keen on applications involving hotels, student housing, anything that makes for more transient population. We prefer a stable and permanent population to maintain social cohesion in the borough. We want to promote economic activity. We have a strong interest in the environment, in greening the environment, planting trees, improving air quality and architectural placemaking to try and improve the social accessibility of the borough. We're interested in sustainability, which includes insulation, energy use and energy sources, and we are also very, very keen on upholding and improving architectural design quality. So in terms of the sorts of planning gain that the council are looking for when you see it through the lens of community wealth building, top of the list is our affordable housing policy, which is for 50% of all developments to be affordable. Affordable can be a mixture of social rent properties and shared ownership, although in fact we're finding that shared ownership is actually becoming out of reach for a lot of people on fairly middle range incomes these days, especially in the south of the borough, and so we're tending to favour more entirely social rent, but 50% is our policy and we work very hard to get it. Following on the tails of the affordable housing policy has been our affordable workspace policy, which is 10% of any additions to workspace at a peppercorn rent to be operated by the council or an agent appointed by the council to provide starter workspace for organisations that can't afford what have historically been very, very high office rents in the London area, although that position is shifting at the moment and office rents are coming down, so that is in turn having its impact on our affordable workspace policy. We seek skills training and apprenticeships, and for construction projects we're always looking for work placements for local people on those projects so we can get them trained up. We look for carbon offsets, we require travel plans. All new housing developments now are car free except for disabled spaces, so we're trying to do as much as we can to remove the car from the environment in all but the essential instances. We ask for energy network connections so that we can get district heating systems working either now or in the future. We look for environmental benefits. As I mentioned earlier, we are very keen on promoting not just good architectural design but exceptional architectural design, and when applicants manage to come along with exceptional architectural design, we do sometimes see that as a tradable in terms of achieving a planning balance. And obviously all of these different planning gains have to be set out in a legal document, the Section 106 document. And so what you tend to find is after considering the plans and designs for a building and its technical performance, actually a very large amount of the negotiation and the final sculpting of an application into an acceptable form for the borough takes place through the vehicle of the mechanism of the Section 106 agreement. In terms of challenges to achieving planning in Islington, obviously it's a very densely populated borough, and it's already, in terms of the built environment, it's very congested. Tends to mean that we have very little development space left in the borough, and most development involves redevelopment or enhancing and altering existing buildings, which inevitably means increases in height, scale, bulk, massing and footprint, which can be very controversial, especially for people living nearby, and also generates issues for daylight and sunlight of adjoining properties, which we have to watch very carefully. There can be noise issues either from the use of the building themselves or plant and equipment on the roof. Light pollution from offices that work late at night has become more of an issue in the last few years. We're having to include conditions on things like having automatic blinds that close at a certain time so that the light pollution doesn't disturb neighbouring residential properties, and servicing access, both refuse collections and deliveries. Where does that happen? How does it happen? Can we get it to happen without blocking the streets at the same time and not causing massive increases to traffic in the area? All of these kinds of issues are brought up by objectors all the time at planning committee and through objection to applications. Another challenge, of course, is viability. That is the financial calculation of what a developer can afford to provide us in terms of planning gain, and in particular in terms of affordable housing. It's no surprise to know that developers are endlessly creative in their attempts to try and argue down and negotiate down their contribution. But a particular landmark for Islington was about 10 years ago a scheme on an old territorial army unit plot with a very large parade ground behind it. It was a housing scheme. It was in Parkhurst Road, and the developer told us that they couldn't provide any affordable housing at all because they paid too much for the site. We refused it on that basis because they didn't provide affordable housing. They went to appeal, the refusal was upheld. They took it to the High Court, and the High Court upheld our refusal and said that in their view a site should be valued using the standard RICS valuation Red Book method, not the price that was paid for the site. So this was a landmark judgment for us in Islington, but actually created a very useful precedent for local authorities all across the country. And we continue. We were one of the first boroughs to introduce a subsidiary plan for calculating viability, to set out a methodology so that we were comparing eggs with eggs when different developers put in their viability appraisals. But we continue to fight our corner on that, and we're absolutely determined to get a believable and workable viability out of developers. We're also very dependent, of course, on the willingness of developers to work with us on planning benefit. We find that some developers get Islington and what we're trying to do, and others just see it as a battle and to be fought, and as much attrition as they can get out of it. So we are, and we know which developers we like and which ones we don't, frankly. But also, this isn't exactly a challenge, but this is the kind of concept that's emerged from some of the applications we've dealt with. It is this principle of exceptionality, where if a developer wants to do something that breaches policy in one respect, if they can provide us with exceptionality in terms of some of the planning gain we're looking for, we can balance that against the breach, say the height breach, assuming we can deal with the daylight and all those kinds of issues. A particularly interesting example was some years ago now, a building called Finsbury Tower, which is just by Bunhill Fields burial ground, where the developer actually wanted to double the height of the tower, right next to this Grade 1 listed burial ground. We had several pre-application meetings with them, and in one of these meetings, the height of the tower was described as exceptional, and I made the point that if they wanted exceptional height, they needed to provide us with exceptional planning gain. And they went away, and they came back with an offer to provide affordable workspace instead of for 10 years in perpetuity, which was a very, very significant planning gain for us. And at that point, we were happy to trade the exceptional height for the exceptional offer on the workspace. So that concept of exceptionality runs through a lot of our assessments, especially by the time we get to committee, and it comes down to the question whether the committee is convinced that we are actually getting fair value from the application. And then we come back to the point I made at the start of my introductory comments about why did the King's Head Theatre relocation project take so long? Well, we had to establish that the space was in fact protected under planning. We had to look back through old planning consents from 1970 and discovered that in fact the use of that space as a theatre had been consented. It was therefore protected. The King's Head, if they wanted to cease the use in their building, were therefore obligated to re-provide it somewhere else, which was what then tilted them into negotiating with the developers of Islington Square to find an alternative home. We had to fit the theatre into the new development, and we discussed at some length with the developers whereabouts in the development it would go. They started off wanting to put it right at the back of the site, with an entrance that was in a residential street, away from Upper Street and awkward to get to, and a very bad arrangement for trying to get 200 or 300 people in and out of a show. I told them that it needed to be at the front of the site, and preferably with the entrance straight through the archway next to the King's Head pub, which is what we've in fact got. And so the entrance to the King's Head Theatre is now right behind where it used to be. We had to get the design right of the theatre once we'd established the space, and we had to deliver a combined application for the change of use of the pub with the application for the theatre, and we had to negotiate a transfer agreement with Young's that ensured that the theatre was actually delivered. And in the end, what we arrived at was an agreement that the theatre space use in the pub would not cease until this theatre was open and operational, which, as you can see today, it is, which is hugely gratifying. We had to negotiate a financial contribution for the theatre from Young's for the cost and inconvenience of them moving out of their old home. We had to get the Section 106 signed, which always seems to be a very lengthy process. But I think that the complications involved and the length of time involved in achieving this, 10 years from start to finish, does actually typify the nature of the planning journey in Islington, because it is complex and because we are seeking a lot of planning benefits, and also the difficulties of the nature of the existing built environment and squeezing new developments into that environment without having negative impacts on the adjoining buildings. We are, as a council, as a planning authority and a committee, we are very tenacious with applicants. Personally, I like to keep the ball in play rather than threaten refusals. And so we quite not infrequently we will defer when the committee is not quite sure in a committee meeting, send the applicants away and get them to make amendments, bring it back and give them their approval. I like applications to be oven ready when they're brought to committee. I don't like a bum fight with the applicants in the meeting. And I don't believe in pushing applications to appeal as a kind of lazy option to avoid having to take awkward decisions. I think it's our duty to actually grasp and take those decisions. We've got a strong track record of hard-won approvals. We've got Holloway Prison approved now. That actually took 3 separate 4-hour-long committee meetings to approve. The committee went into it in such detail. But we got out of that nearly 1,000 new homes with 60% affordable, which was quite an achievement, and a women's building as well, in honour of the previous use of the site. Finsbury Tower I mentioned before, which established the exceptionality rule. Parkhurst Road, which I mentioned, where in fact what's been built there now has 50% affordable housing, where the original developer claimed he couldn't build any. So that was a very particularly gratifying outcome. We've got Regent's Wharf down by the canal, where we had to take some very strong objections from local residents face on and try and basically negotiate with the objectors in the meeting and try and convince them that we got the application to a point where it was acceptable, which we managed to do. And also smaller things like the Angel Central shopping centre down the road, which has an enormous steel wings sculpture round the back facing Liverpool Road. The centre changed hands about 6 years ago, and the new owners came to us saying that they wanted to build a bridge across the back and get rid of the sculpture. Well, what are you going to do with the sculpture? Well, you could stick it in a public park or something like that. And we're saying, well, who's going to maintain it? How, you know, what? And it's a significant part of that development. Once again, I said to them, look, why don't you put it further up in the air and put the bridge underneath it? Which is what they have done. And in fact, it's improved the look and presentation of the sculpture enormously, because it actually works better higher in the air. So again, that was a very satisfying outcome by actually sort of actively and constructively intervening in an application. So the King's Head Theatre took 10 years to move, 10 yards probably, and probably a lot of feet underground. It took 10 years, but we got there in the end, and we got a very good outcome. And there it is.